Sky box office pay-per-view figures have been revealed for Anthony Joshua and several other fighters from 1966 to 2018. Now, obviously, there was no Sky box office in 1966, so they also included in this list are figures from other pay-per-view entities other than Sky. And also, it has to be said, it says here in the article, figures were taken from various media reports and sources, plus the Broadcasters Audience Research Board. And because of that, we don't know if all these figures are accurate. In fact, looking through this list, some of these fights, I'm not even sure were actually on pay-per-view in the UK. You guys can correct me, where I may be wrong here. But let's go through the list anyway. It's a pretty interesting list. Now, I'm going to focus on, let me just go through all of them. To hell with it. I was going to try to pick out the highlights, but let's just go through all of them. All right, Ali versus Henry Cooper, 40,000. Now, there was no pay-per-view in 1966. I wonder if the 40,000 was the people who attended closed circuit screenings of Ali versus Henry Cooper, like at theaters and cinemas and stuff like that in 1966. Perhaps that's what it was, the 40,000. Then it jumps forward 3 decades to Frank Bruno versus Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson 2, that was pay-per-view. I remember that. 600,000 buys on Sky Box Office, and that was Sky Box Office. So yeah, 600,000 buys. Pretty good for an overseas fight. But again, hear what I'm telling you about heavyweight boxing back in the 1990s in the UK compared to now. Heavyweight boxing is more popular in the UK now than it was in the 90s. A couple of people took issue with me when I said that in the last video where I was talking about the big fight live on ITV. Heavyweight boxing today in the UK is way more popular and bigger than it was in the 1990s. Trust me. Most people, the average Brit in the 1990s, didn't even know who Lennox Lewis was. I can assure you of that. It was only people who follow boxing with some regularity who knew who Lennox Lewis was. They wouldn't necessarily all be hardcore fans, but there were people who would keep an eye on boxing. Those people knew who Lennox Lewis was. But the average Joe walking the street in the United Kingdom in the 1990s, they didn't know who Lennox Lewis was. Anthony Joshua is way more popular and famous than Lennox Lewis. Frank Bruno was very famous and popular in the UK back in the 80s and 90s. But even he, against Mike Tyson, a guy who was a household name in the UK, even he only did 600,000 pay-per-view buys on Sky Box Office back in 96 when he fought the rematch with Tyson. Anyway, then there was Prince Nassim versus Tom Johnson. Now, I can't remember if that was Sky Box Office. It probably was, because Prince Nassim was box office from pretty early on. I'm pretty sure actually, let me not say whether his fight against Tom Johnson was box office or not. It probably was, but I can't remember now. But I can believe that Nassim versus Tom Johnson may have been pay-per-view. That did 650,000. Holyfield Tyson was certainly pay-per-view. Holyfield Tyson 2. That did 550,000 pay-per-view buys. Holyfield Lewis, 400,000. And there you go again. This fight between Tyson and Holyfield did more pay-per-view buys than the undisputed heavyweight championship fight between Lewis and Holyfield, and Lewis was a British fighter, only did 400,000 buys in the UK. Then year 2000, Mike Tyson. See, here's one thing I can tell you as well. Mike Tyson was more well-known in the UK than Lennox Lewis, even though Lennox Lewis is British. There are various reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because heavyweight boxing in the UK was not as popular back then as it is right now. Tyson Francis did 500,000 buys. It's good going for Tyson there. And that was Tyson in the twilight of his career. Before he fought Lewis, yes, but after he'd fought Holyfield. Lewis Tyson did 750,000 buys in the UK, which decent, but nothing compared to what we would later see when it comes to pay-per-view buys in the United Kingdom on Sky Box Office. Mayweather versus Ricky Hatton did over 1 million pay-per-view buys. That was a huge, huge pay-per-view in the United Kingdom and a very big deal. Ricky Hatton, definitely one of the most popular fighters the UK has ever seen. Amir Khan versus Kotelnik, 100,000. Was that on pay-per-view? Maybe it was. 100,000 buys. Valaev against Haye, that was definitely pay-per-view. That did 469,000. Haye versus Ruiz, relatively poor numbers for David Haye, right? He would have been hoping for something like this, 469. But I think maybe the fact that the Valaev fight was so boring put a lot of the UK public off. So his next fight against Ruiz did far, far fewer pay-per-view buys. Froch Kessler, only 50,000 buys. That's when Froch, to be fair to him, was building up his profile. Brook versus Jennings. You see, this is where I'm scratching my head. Was that a pay-per-view? Kell Brook versus Michael Jennings in 2010? Was that a pay-per-view? It did 15,000 buys, which is obviously very poor. But I'm amazed that Kell Brook versus Michael Jennings was a pay-per-view. Was it top of the bill pay-per-view, or was it on a different show, you know, on an undercard of someone else's show? But either way, 15,000 is very poor. Haye Harrison, that was pay-per-view, 223,000 buys. The less said about that, the better, about that show. Khan Maidana, again, was Khan Maidana pay-per-view in the UK? Was it? I can't remember now, but I just feel like that wasn't pay-per-view. Maybe I'm wrong, but for some reason I feel like that wasn't pay-per-view. But here it says 164,000 buys. Khan versus McCluskey, 200,000 buys. Groves versus DeGale, 43,000. So Khan's doing some good numbers here against McCluskey, if that was actually a pay-per-view. Groves DeGale, 43 is, you know, not a great amount of buys, but that was a British title fight. Klitschko versus David Haye did over 1 million. I did a lot of buys there. Froch Kessler 32,000. So Froch wasn't doing big pay-per-view numbers, was he? In his early days. Froch Groves 47,000 for the first one. Was Froch Groves 1 pay-per-view? You guys are probably screaming at the computer screen right now, or at your phone screen saying, of course it was pay-per-view. I just can't remember. I remember the fights, obviously, but whether they were pay-per-view or not, I don't remember with all of them. Was Froch Groves 1 a pay-per-view? I don't know. Maybe it was. Froch Groves 2 was certainly a pay-per-view. I know that. That did I mean, look at the jump in buys from the first to the second fight. Jesus. 47,000 for the first, 355,000 for the second, for the rematch. Just a few months later, remember. Less than a year later. Massive difference. Brook versus Frankie Gavin, that was pay-per-view. That was one of the most scandalous pay-per-views that Eddie Hearn has ever done. Putting Kell Brook versus Frankie Gavin as the headline of a pay-per-view. Shocking stuff. Shocking. It was a relatively stacked card from what I remember, but still, if this is the headlining fight, jeez, you got some nerve to be putting that on pay-per-view. That did 139,000 buys. Interesting, isn't it, that Brook versus Gavin was doing better numbers than the likes of Carl Froch versus Kessler. And even Froch versus Groves 1. Brook Gavin did way better figures. But I guess this was Eddie Hearn just starting to do better figures, because these previous events, they were not promoted by Eddie Hearn. Well, sorry, some of them were promoted by, I'm talking about the ones that were doing good numbers were not Haye, were not Eddie Hearn events. Haye Ruiz was not Eddie Hearn. The Khan events were not Eddie Hearn. Groves DeGale, the first fight, was not Eddie Hearn. Klitschko Haye was not Eddie Hearn. Froch Kessler was Hearn. Actually, Froch Kessler 2 was Hearn. Froch Kessler 1 was not Hearn. Brook Gavin was Hearn. Yeah. So this might have been the turning point for Eddie Hearn. Brook Gavin, weirdly enough. In fact, no. The turning point for Eddie Hearn was Froch Groves. That's probably when his pay-per-view situation started going through the roof, when it was on the up and up, was from the Froch Groves first fight, the way that ended, the controversy created, that helped build Eddie Hearn's pay-per-view standing. Let's just put it that way. Okay, Mayweather Pacquiao, 186,000. That's disappointing, isn't it, in the UK, those numbers? That's disappointing. It's still good numbers, but when you think of how big Mayweather and Pacquiao both were, you might have expected more than that. But then again, Mayweather and Pacquiao were not like Mike Tyson back in the days. You know, Mike Tyson, everybody in the UK knew Mike Tyson. Everybody and their granny knew Mike Tyson. Whereas not everybody and their granny in the UK knows Mayweather and Pacquiao. Some people do, some people don't, you know. Anyway, Klitschko Fury did 545. Joshua Dylan Whyte did 420. That might be a record in terms of pay-per-view buys for a British title fight. In fact, I'm sure it is. Correct me if I'm wrong, people, but I don't think a British title fight has ever sold as many pay-per-views as that. Frampton Quigg, 304. Joshua Martin, 500,000. It's good numbers for Joshua for his first ever heavyweight title fight. Slightly more against Dominic Brazil, 512. Golovkin, Kell Brook, 500,000. So that's pretty good going for Kell Brook to be on a par with Joshua in terms of pay-per-view buys, if these figures are accurate, because we can't expect that all of them are exactly accurate. Some of them may be off because they're from different sources. Joshua Molina, interestingly, did 50,000 less buys than Brazil or Martin. Interesting. Haye Bellew did very, very well. Now, what does this show us right here? This shows us that David Haye, up until March 2017, potentially was still a bigger box office draw than Anthony Joshua was. Because Joshua's doing 5K, 1,000, 500,000, then 450. But along comes David Haye doing nearly 900,000 buys against Tony Bellew. Remember, that Bellew, the first Bellew fight, was seen as a mismatch by a lot of people. And Bellew was not a pay-per-view fighter at this point. So it was really David Haye is the reason that it did nearly 900,000 pay-per-view buys. So David Haye was still very, very big. And I think one of the reasons is because David Haye had his 2 comeback fights on terrestrial television on Channel 5. And that helped generate this kind of pay-per-view figure when he fought his 3rd comeback fight on Sky. So David Haye did very, very well from that. And he's probably still eating very well because of that pay-per-view there. Joshua Klitschko, that has the record, I believe, for the most amount of pay-per-views ever sold for a British fight in the UK. 1.5 million buys. 1,532,000 buys. Incredible numbers. Incredible. Absolutely killed it with that. Just imagine, just do the math in terms of working out how much money that generated. It generated millions and millions and millions and millions just the pay-per-view alone. More than Klitschko Haye, more than Mayweather Hatton. You know, tremendous, tremendous numbers. So Joshua's killing it right now. Then there was Brooks Spence, 275,000. It's okay-ish, I guess. Mayweather McGregor, 874,000. Joshua Takam, you can see the number dropping off a little bit there because it wasn't a unification. And people, and also because Pulev pulled out. And, you know, whenever somebody pulls out, there's always a little bit of negative publicity around that. So we have to bear that in mind. Then Joshua again, nearly 1.5 million pay-per-view buys against Joseph Parker. I mean, these are just phenomenal numbers. To be selling this amount of pay-per-views is crazy. And David Haye fought Tony Bellew in a rematch, slightly less than the first fight in terms of pay-per-view figures, but still good. And then finally, Dylan Whyte versus Joseph Parker, 474,000. For Dylan Whyte's first pay-per-view, those are very good numbers. I mean, when I'm talking about Dylan Whyte being the headline fighter in a pay-per-view, because he obviously fought a pay-per-view against Joshua, but he was the opponent, right, in that fight. This was Dylan Whyte's pay-per-view, and he did 474,000. That's good going. Dylan Whyte's going to be eating well off the money that he pocketed from this pay-per-view for a while. So good luck to him. Yeah, let me know what you think of these pay-per-view figures, people. Again, they're from various different sources. We don't know how accurate they are, but if we cross-reference, and this is just off the top of my head, thinking back to interviews that I've seen with Eddie Hearn, where he has revealed pay-per-view numbers or revealed ballpark figures for pay-per-view numbers on Sky, many of these figures ring true to me. I can remember him, talking about some of these fights and giving ballpark figures in terms of what they did on pay-per-view sales. So I think a lot of them are probably accurate. Maybe most of them are accurate, but who knows? Let me know what you think in the comment section below, people. It's happening. I'm out.